Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Chupka. I'm the Vice President for Research and Programs here at the Energy Storage Association. Thank you for attending today's webinar on entitled Growing Together, the Booming Market for Solar and Storage. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone who registered will also receive a link to the recording and slides within the next couple of days. Questions can be submitted at any time via the questions chat box in your browser, and we'll get to those after our speakers finish their presentations. In the text of your question, please indicate to whom you would like your question addressed. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members area of the ESA website. If you're not yet an ESA member and would like more information, you can reach out to my colleague, Brenda Lovell. Membership includes free access to all of our webinars, including many that are exclusively for members, along with numerous other benefits. Please contact Brenda for more information. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about some upcoming events. The first upcoming event is coming up right after this webinar. We'll keep the conversation going about solar plus storage with Neil Bradshaw of SunGrow. All registrants received an invitation, and we'll also put that invitation in the webinar chat to copy and paste into your browser. There's no charge to join, but we won't be recording that conversation. Second, if you want to take a much deeper dive into solar and storage, we'll be holding a technical workshop on solar and storage on August 4th. Save that date. We'll be opening registration and announcing speakers tomorrow. Finally, the ESA annual conference will be held in Phoenix on December 1st through 3rd. It will be great to see everyone again. Today, we're exploring the growing convergence between photovoltaic solar generation and energy storage on the grid. This is one of the fastest growing segments in front of the meter PV and storage markets, and provides a great example of how storage can enhance the reliability and value of clean energy from variable resources. I'm delighted to introduce a great panel for today's discussion. First up will be Will Gorman, a researcher in electricity markets and policy development at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Will and his colleagues at NBNL have been tracking the increase in hybrid and co-located facilities and analyzing the value of PV and storage for several years. Gigio Sakota will be next, and he's the Director of Energy Markets at 8-Minute Energy. Gigio will describe the advantages of hybrid and co-located solar plus storage facilities from the perspective of a leading solar developer. Our final presenter is John Newman, who is a market applications associate at Fluence, a large storage equipment provider for solar plus storage plants. John will share his perspective on how energy storage can add value to a PV facility, whether AC or DC coupled, and under various use cases. After their remarks, we'll open up to audience Q&A. You can ask questions via the chat box at any time, and we'll read those out for the presenters when we get to the Q&A session at the end. Now I'll turn it over to Will.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Mark. I'm assuming I'm coming through loud and clear. So great, yeah. So as Mark said, my name is Will Gorman. I'm a researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where we've been working on trying to understand these hybrid, co-located, on this slide you see coupled, there's a lot of different words out there, for this pretty dramatic development of solar plus storage projects. And I've been fortunate to lead a lot of the economic valuation work that we've been doing at the National Lab on this topic. But we've also been doing a lot of other types of analyses when it comes to these projects, and there's been many other collaborators on this work. So I'm going to be fortunate enough to share some of that as we go through this slide, as we go through these slides. So as the title kind of mentions, one of the key motivating questions of our work in regards to this topic is trying to tease out why this trend is happening. And so that's what this question kind of gets at. Are coupled renewable battery power plants more valuable than independently sited installations? And so as we go through this deck, hopefully I can give you some insight into enter the answer to that question. And then before jumping in, just a word of warning, there's a lot of dense information in this slide, which is notorious for a researcher to do. So I apologize in advance, but please keep your questions kind of front and center. Hopefully we'll have more time to illuminate some of maybe the more complicated messages that I have in here, as I'm going to go somewhat quickly. So let's see if these, great. So first, just want to open up just to set the stage for what this trend is really meaning in the United States. And so what I show here is a collection of data from the 37 ISO and utility interconnection queues around the United States. This represents roughly 85% of US load. And you can see the different technologies on the x-axis here. And you can see that solar by far is the dominant player in these interconnection queues. And then in the hatched portion of these bars, you can see the amount of that technology that is being paired with storage. So a few things pop out of this chart. First is that this trend is definitely a solar plus storage trend. There obviously is some wind plus storage and a smattering of gas plus storage, but the predominant configuration out there is with solar. And the other thing you can see is that a decent amount of the storage that is being proposed in these queues is being co-located. And you can see that in the hatched bar of the storage section. Diving in a little bit to the regional trends in regards to this development, we break up the different ISOs and different regions of the United States, and then on this table show the percentage of each technology that is hybridizing or co-locating a battery technology. So what you see here is that CAISO in California and the non-ISO West, so this is basically every other state in the West that is not California, those are the biggest areas which are seeing this development, where 90% in California and 70% in the non-ISO West of the solar capacity is being paired with batteries. Those percentages drop pretty dramatically once you turn to wind, but that regional trend still holds. And then the last thing to mention on this slide is that you can turn to the battery column. And you see again, when it comes to battery development in California, you see the most amount of batteries being proposed in this hybrid configuration. We don't have data for all of the regions, but interestingly, we do have it for New York ISO, where a significantly less amount of the proposed battery technologies are being proposed in this combination. And some of the economic analysis and valuation analysis that I'll show a little bit later on the slide presentation will illuminate a little bit of why that might be the case. So one of the big trends and drivers of this increase is, and no doubt, the dramatic decline of costs. And so what I'm showing here is a collection of PPAs that my colleague Mark Bollinger has put together up at the lab to show that over the last 5 years, there's been significant declines in these PPAs, both in Hawaii and in the rest of the United States, which is the distinguishing between the blue and orange bubbles. And in many cases, the costs for these PPAs have halved over those 5 years. In the bottom chart, what we can do in a select number of the PPAs that have been released and are available for public viewing, we can actually extract out the levelized storage adder that comes in these PV battery projects. So the amount that these PV plants are increasing their cost due to adding batteries. And we can vary that by the battery to PV capacity ratio to see that there's roughly a linear trend. As you increase your battery size, there's a linear increase in the cost. And the reason I put this slide in here is because this y-axis, the magnitude of these storage adders, are going to be important to compare to some of the valuation calculations we do. So think about a 50% battery to PV capacity ratio, adding about $10 to $15 a megawatt hour to the cost of a standalone PV project. But the main point here is costs are declining, and that's driving a lot of this development. In some of our earlier work, we've qualitatively outlined some of the pros and cons to hybridization and co-location of solar plus storage versus developing the standalone battery and generator plants. I include that list here. You can read more at this paper that's open access in the Electricity Journal. But at a high level, what we're seeing is that there are definitely cost synergies to choosing to co-locate solar and storage. So they qualify for more financial incentives. There's also shared permitting, siting, equipment, interconnection, transmission and transaction costs. So that's a big reason. There's also some market value synergies. So batteries can capture clipped energy. I think John is going to go into this in a little bit more graphical detail in his presentation. But there's also some market design rules that may end up valuing hybrids more than standalone batteries. But there are some constraints. There are some operational flexibility concerns depending on how you are structuring the facility. And then there's also this question, which has been core to my research, which is the suboptimal siting potentially of those batteries away from congested areas, because wind and solar can only go in so many sites. There's obviously a decent amount of regulatory uncertainty here, both with what's going to happen in the future with federal incentives and the market rules for these technologies. And that uncertainty is always a challenge when developing a new technology. But again, the key kind of question that I'm interested in here is the paradigm shifting on how to site power plants? Is a little bit of a I don't want to say a controversial, but provocative point, which, traditionally we were using transmission to balance the network, and co-location suggests maybe a different type of balancing paradigm might be more advantageous. And there's many different reasons that could be: transmission constraints, operational cost synergies that I mentioned, and federal incentives. And this is really what we're trying to tease apart in the research that we're doing up at the lab. So motivating research questions. I'm about to transition into some of the more economic valuation part of this presentation. And these are the questions that we had in mind when doing a lot of this modeling of market value of these projects. And first is, can these market revenues explain why there's much higher commercial activity in the West? Can they explain why there is much higher activity for solar as opposed to wind? And then finally, does this independent siting paradigm not necessarily apply to these new technology configurations? So I won't really spend too much time sitting here in the methods, mainly because we don't have time. So if there is confusion, happy to answer questions in the Q&A or offline. But at a high level, what we do is we have an optimization algorithm that assumes either perfect foresight of that hybrid resource or develops an optimal schedule with day-ahead prices and then realizes revenue in the real-time market. So we have an optimistic and pessimistic case. And then we dispatch those across an entire year. And so we have LMP prices for 10 years over all of the nodes in all 7 ISO markets across the United States. So it's a pretty comprehensive analysis that we're doing to try to compare regional trends and the value of these types of projects. So what do we find? So this first slide, I'm just going to describe a metric that we term the storage value adder. So I mentioned a little bit earlier on that PPA slide, if you remember, the storage cost adder, so the increased cost of a PPA. Well, now I'm going to look at the corresponding value adder. And we break that up by ISO and by solar and wind. And what we found is that CAISO is leading the way, which is in line with the market trends. And that trend CAISO, I guess, began to diverge from the other markets in 2015, which is in lockstep with its increase in solar penetration. So there's some linkage between how the increase of solar potentially drives value decline of a standalone solar resource. And so as you add storage, the storage value adder goes up. Another interesting point here is that ERCOT in Texas had the lowest storage value adder over the years that we studied, besides 2019. And in 2019, that was a particularly important year for scarcity pricing. So there was a lot of peak price periods in Texas, and storage clearly could take advantage of that. But that obviously means that there's a little bit more risk in that market, as scarcity pricing events might not always happen. And the last point I want to make on this slide is that we actually didn't find too big of a disconnect between solar coupling and wind coupling in terms of this metric. There is one in California where you see the value of solar is higher than wind, which is related to this solar penetration trend. But it was somewhat interesting to find that. The second part of our analysis, when we think about valuation, is really trying to understand, well, what could you get if you had an independent battery being sited away from a solar and wind node? And so to answer that question, we looked at all of the 50,000 nodes across the United States where there is a wholesale market price for electricity. And we identified those that had solar, we identified those that had wind, and then we found the ones that were most volatile, so the ones that potentially had the highest value for an independent battery. And so what you can see here on the bottom graphic is the storage value at those different nodes. And you can see there's a decent amount of overlap between those high value nodes and solar and wind nodes, but there is an additional value that you can get at high value nodes. And our question was really, how big does that value affect the ultimate revenue that these plants, these hybrid co-located plants can receive? So that's what I'm now showing you on this chart. The same structure as the one you saw 2 slides earlier, but now on the y-axis, there's what I'm calling the coupling penalty. So the penalty to co-locating these resources across markets. And we found that there are significant penalties. So that additional value that you could get from independent siting could be large. I mean, we're talking anywhere from $5 to, in some markets, up to $50 a megawatt hour. And interesting, just to kind of give some flavor for why this is happening. New York somewhat stands out in this graphic, which importantly aligns with some of that data that I showed earlier, where there's not a lot of this coupling activity happening in New York, but there's some other reasons for that as well, just in terms of market rules. But what this kind of illuminates is that in New York, there's a big congestion pocket, obviously in New York City, a big load center. And on Long Island, there are some transmission constraints. And it's hard to site a solar and wind project at those locations, right? There's not that much land available. And so what we found in this work is that is where batteries could see a significant amount of value in that market, especially in 2014. But you can't have a wind and solar site there. And so those kind of considerations will be very important when watching this trend unfold over the next decade. Last 2 slides here, I'll wrap it up and then we'll transfer it over to Giorgio. But a key point, I mentioned in this prior slide that there are some significant coupling penalties. We did do an analysis where we varied some of the sensitivities and some of our modeling choices. I won't have time to dive into what those are. But you can see that in this graphic, where our sensitivity cases reduce that coupling penalty from an average of $12 a megawatt hour to $1 a megawatt hour. And you can then compare that penalty, that average penalty, to the potential cost savings of coupling. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that there's some federal incentives to this paradigm. There's also construction cost savings, and I show those somewhat illustratively in the bars on the right. And you can see that somewhat outweighs this coupling penalty. And I think, to me, that really signifies that there's a reason why this trend obviously is happening. There is an economic reason behind it. And you will have to think not only about maybe some of the additional constraints, but also some of the cost savings to this development. So that's all I have here. Just quick conclusions. I know I went really, really fast. I encourage you to look on our website for the detailed reports that will go through these analyses, as well as reach out to me. But high-level conclusions that we've been finding in our research: commercial interest in these projects is growing rapidly and differs from the convention of independent siting. We did find that coupled projects significantly boost VRE value across all markets in the US. So that's that storage value adder metric. And in some markets, that value is higher than the PPA cost that I showed in earlier slides. But there is a penalty to restricting your battery to a wind or solar node, which we found, but that might be offset by the cost savings. But overall, region-specific analysis, which considers nodal volatility, I think will be pretty important to informing specific siting decisions in the future, where siting in the past might have been mostly driven by wind or solar resource potential. So with that, I will end my whirlwind tour of some of our research. That's my email if anyone wants to reach out, and the full project team want to acknowledge them. And yeah, thank you for listening. Looking forward to the Q&A portion.
Thank you, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on which time zone you are. I'm Gigi Sakota. I'm at 8-Minute Solar Energy, and I will be chatting more of the, I'll call it the developer experience or perspective on some of these issues. So I'll start with a quick introduction of 8-Minute. So we're the nation's largest independent solar and storage developer, and with a pretty sizable pipeline. I think on this slide we show about, basically a 20 gigawatt pipeline. I think those numbers are actually going to go up shortly, but a lot of projects, a lot of them focused in essentially the biggest market for these projects. So Southwest, Texas, and a few other areas. And just because I think everybody likes pictures, I figured I'll include a few pictures of some of these projects. And you can kind of tell with time they've been growing in size significantly too. And I think, yeah, these are California and Texas projects, you can see here. So kind of connecting to what we're talking about today is, when 8-Minute was founded, the idea was that, solar essentially would become the cheapest form of electricity powering our planet. And the company was founded in 2009. You could see there was a pretty significant trend up till that point in dropping the price of solar, but still it was quite expensive. I remember when I entered the industry, we're talking about, depending on the technology, but maybe about a $30 to $130 premium for renewable energy. Well, I think you all know the story, and in the last 10 years, we've actually dropped to the point where now solar energy is actually cheaper than gas, electricity, or even coal, which 10 years ago would have been, I wouldn't say unimaginable, but it was definitely far from there. And so looking at this chart, and this is from a 2019 levelized cost of energy by Lazard. 2020 prices dropped, and then they actually went up a little bit with the recent kind of supply chain impacts. But if you look at a range of facilities and technologies, not only is solar cheaper than fossil fuel or conventional fuel plants on a levelized cost basis, but we're even talking at marginal cost. So if you just look at the marginal cost of gas and coal, solar costs can be all in cheaper. Now, a point that was mentioned earlier is there is a difference if you're building solar only versus solar with storage. Obviously, when you're building with storage, you're getting more flexibility of when to use that energy. And so that does increase the cost, but it also significantly increases the value of that energy. But again, to use one of the 8-Minute projects, and I think these PPA prices were public because it was it was signed with the city of LA. We're talking about $20 per megawatt hour for solar only, and less than $40 per megawatt hour for solar with storage, which again beats out a lot of these resources out there. So kind of quickly reviewing the history of how we got here and kind of where we're at now, but essentially we're at the point where clean energy resources such as solar and storage are the economic and reliable choice today. This started with state and federal policies, which got utilities to start buying renewables. Again, at the time, there was this idea of REC premium. There was energy independence goals. And so we had federal and state tax credit programs. Obviously, everybody's familiar with ITC, PTC, but we also had some state tax incentives. A lot of them were kind of solar rooftop type of things, but also, for example, for solar facilities in California, you actually don't pay property tax. So there's a range of incentives that were push to encourage these technologies. I would say another way was really sustainability goals. And so a lot of corporates got involved because they saw the, I'll call it the benefit and value and importance of being more sustainable, both from a, call it a true desire for, creating less impact, but also there is a, I'll call it a marketable aspect to that, because that's something that, consumers have been asking to. And so, companies have been trying to reduce their carbon impact. And so, they've been reaching out and signing PPAs to get clean energy. And really now the, economics makes solar and storage the best choice for most buyers. And so solar is the cheapest energy available in many markets. Storage obviously allows for meeting that 24/7 energy needs. And this is something also that, both utilities, load sharing entities and corporates are starting to realize that it's not just that you need the energy, but you also need the dispatchability with it, so you can have that energy at the time you need it, right? And the ratio of these two distinct resources can be tailored for buyers' needs, right? How much energy do you need? How much capacity you need? At what time of the day you need it? Another interesting aspect really is that I think reliability is starting to come to light. And historically, people have looked at renewables as sort of, hey, when the sun shines, it's there. When the wind blows, it's there, but you can't really rely on it. But really, the data shows another story. I know some of these issues have gotten politicized, but if you look at the Texas blackouts, it was actually fossil resources that were the main driver. There was more than 50% outage rate on fossil fueled resources. And big part of that was just lack of fuel, or pipelines freezing, or just basically not being able to get that fuel to the plants. There was also hybridization issues and other things going on. While actually renewables, if you look compared to forecast levels, they're actually performing quite well. And so, if you look at a solar and storage facility, we're talking about achieving 97% plus availability, which is actually higher than what you can see from standard gas plants, which, if it's hot, they can suffer derates. If it's cold, they're not properly weatherized, they could suffer issues. And so it's, the interesting part is really that it's both becoming the economic choice, the reliable choice, and of course, it's a clean choice. Now, if you look at all of these factors, they're really driving additions of a significant amount of renewable and storage. I'm showing here California, again, one of the areas where a lot of these resources are being added. But obviously, Texas is adding a lot of solar, wind, and storage, as well as other areas. Now, this specific slide is identical to what I presented about 6 months ago. And the reason I brought it up is because back then, this was actually looking at not the approved plan by the IRP, but one of the plans they looked at. So there was a 38 million metric tons portfolio. There was also, I believe, a 48 million metric tons portfolio, which was sort of the one they were leaning toward, or at least they had an authorized procurement toward this 38 portfolio. But move forward 6 months, and we're actually, CPUC just issued an order for 11.5 gigawatts of new procurement. They're actually now, officially favoring the 38 million metric tons portfolio, which is the one, myself and many other folks had assumed that really it's what California would move to. And this new trajectory increases the role for storage and even brings up the need for longer duration storage. And just kind of this, we're expecting further decisions from the CPUC for additional procurement, within a year or so. So again, we're seeing this steep increase, year over year of resources being added. Now, as was mentioned earlier, hybrid and collocated resources do offer the best economics. I'll kind of quickly throw in a definition of a hybrid and collocated resource for reference. And it's really just how they're operated in the market of, hybrid resources, operating as a single resource, even though you have two, I'll call it two different fuel sources or two different technologies. Collocated is physically similar, but CAISO or, resource operator sees two separate resources that kind of have individual bids, individual dispatches, but in aggregate, behave similar as a hybrid resource. So these hybrid and collocated resources, as mentioned a little bit earlier, they can share land, facilities, and most importantly, the point of interconnection, which significantly reduces development time and cost. And specifically in California, but I think it's similar across different jurisdictions, is interconnection queues can be long in the best locations and may trigger costly upgrades. And so if you can kind of build two things essentially for the price of one, significantly improves your costs. Another thing is just the timing. If you look at the CAISO's recent Q cluster 14, it's expected to take an extra year to provide results to folks. And it's kind of good and bad news here. Good news is that a lot of people are trying to build projects, and so there's a lot of megawatts in the queue. But CAISO will simply need extra time to analyze this, working with the transmission owners, to figure out what are the upgrades needed for these projects to come online. It was mentioned earlier that energy storage paired with eligible resources can qualify for investment tax credit, but you have to manage for grid charging here, and so to get a full credit, you're not allowed to grid charge. And really, one of the big enablers here was that the CAISO updates tariff to allow this point of interconnection sharing, and so you could have a 100 megawatt solar resource and 100 megawatt storage resource connected to a 100 megawatt interconnection point. And it may sound obvious, that wasn't a rule that was in place before. So it's really something that was added somewhat recently to accommodate these type of resources and savings. One thing that's really that's important here, it's looking at the market. And so, as a developer, ultimately we're looking at what are off-takers, what are buyers really looking? And project off-takers are really showing a range of interests and needs, which can be met with different combinations of solar and storage. And so you kind of have these traditional, I'll call it S-generated clean energy. So you have more traditional solar PPA provides physical energy and renewable energy credits, but even these are evolving where customers are asking for possibly hub settlement or some downside price protection as a curtailment. These provide them with a clean energy hedge, whether physical or financial. We're seeing shaped clean energy products being asked for, and so these are aimed at meeting off-takers overnight or peak resource needs, and they actually may need the long duration storage to deliver desired shape. And so, for example, somebody may need overnight energy or energy during evening peak or whatever their specific need shape may be. They're trying to go out there and sign a PPA that meets it. Obviously, there's virtual PPAs coming aboard, which can have some of the same pieces as the above, but are not. There's no physical power delivery associated. I said, you deliver power to the grid, and there's only a financial transaction with the buyer. We're seeing a lot of solar and storage tolls, and tolls kind of standard industry term, but essentially where the buyer buys the resource and gets to fully dispatch it, as they see fit. And historically, this was common with gas-fired generation, and now it's really aiming at hybrid resources. So you have the solar piece that generates electricity, and you have the storage piece that then allows you to dispatch it, as may best benefit you, whether financially or kind of meeting your load. It's interesting here that it's not just the kind of utilities, the CCAs that are looking for these products, but we're actually seeing corporate buyers and other folks just they're really trying to match their consumption, both consumption needs, and if you want to look at the market exposure with a dispatchable resource. And so we're seeing a lot of interest in these. We're also seeing a fair amount of capacity or RA tags. Again, this was historically common with gas-fired generation, especially for existing generation where you pay them a fee, so that they would be available at time of need. And now these type of contracts are actually also aiming at standalone or hybrid storage to provide capacity at a time of need. An interesting thing here is that while the buyer gets the capacity attribute, seller actually manages the energy and takes on that merchant risk of risk and benefit, right, of how you dispatch it and how you collect the revenues. We're also seeing an interesting new item, which is these kind of energy arbitrage options. As obviously, storage, value of storage is that you can charge at low prices, or in fact, even negative prices, or you're getting paid to charge. and then you can discharge where prices are high and capture this arbitrage value. And we're actually starting to see contracts for that, where buyers will pay you a fixed fee to get that hedge option themselves. Now, those are kind of the asks, if you will, but there's also a lot of risks that come with providing these products for developers. And so, big part is that tax laws are being revisited, clarified, changed, and so there's a lot of details on the ITC, whether it's extension, direct pay, implementation details of how it actually applies to a specific project. There's also been talk about a possible storage ITC. And so all of these can significantly change the economics of your project. There's also state taxes and incentives, and they have been shifting too. One thing that you may be aware too is also supply chain challenges. To begin with, we've seen a lot of costs go up this year for a range of reasons, but ultimately it's raw materials are going up, transportation costs are going up, a lot of pieces have gone up, and hopefully it's a temporary blip, but it's something that folks have to manage through. We're also seeing some supply chain issues with ensuring that the supply chain is clean and free of forced labor, and some challenges there too are if you run a coffee shop and want to sell organic coffee, you can go and buy beans that are certified organic, right? And so somebody out there makes these beans, somebody certifies that they're organic, and you can buy them and sell your organic coffee. With the solar industry, you can't kind of buy certified compliant panels, if you will, with some of these labor practices. So you have to have your own process to make sure that every piece of supply chain you're using is compliant. And what's even more challenging is that there isn't I'll call it a standard for proving that. So it's not really clear how you demonstrate it and what's, I'll call it, sufficient proof that you actually in fact have a adequate supply chain. Another thing that's specific to California, but you may see kind of happen in other areas as well, is California Public Utility Commission is looking at redesigning the California's resource adequacy construct. In other words, how do you count different resources for capacity and what they have to do to provide the capacity? And so if you sign a contract that promises 100 megawatts of capacity, these type of rule changes could essentially change what your product is worth. And so depending on PPA terms, risk may fall into the seller, buyer, or both. Also, CAISO is revisiting elements of the R accounting associated must offer obligation. And there's a couple initiatives looking at this, and this impacts the way you operate a resource in the market, or how you make it available to the market, and what the incentives and penalties or charges may be associated with it. And again, as you've seen, in Texas and California, we really need to kind of update things to make sure lights stay on. And so regulators going through a series of things to ensure that this really is the case, but obviously that has impacts on specific resources. Another item to highlight is CAISO market participation rules are constantly evolving, and they need to, right? As the resource mix is changing, as loads are changing, we need to update those rules. And at times, they bring great improvements, and such as we've seen with the rules enabling hybrid resources. And other times, they can complicate operations or devalue a resource or its attributes. And one issue I've talked before is that some of these rules are actually inconsistent with federal and state policy, such as the CAISO's lack of proper accommodation for ITC grid charging rules. And so even though you have this policy in place that says you get an ITC credit for storage that's paired with solar, CAISO rules don't clearly allow you to actually manage the grid charging constraints that those ITC rules impose on you. And so again, this is something that hopefully we can get more alignment from regulators on, and essentially have rules that are compatible between the CAISO market and what the federal and state policies are. Now, there are challenges at each step, so kind of quickly highlight these. Supply chain has been significantly impacted over the past years. Equity investors can have challenging demands, and so they may have conservative views or expect extra cushion to guarantee their investment. There's some questions on IRS guidelines and kind of wanting to be more conservative there. Another issue I've seen is that investors are skeptical of merchant revenues, especially for storage. So my own take on here is that really, I think markets are currently undervaluing really the value of storage. And currently, you can see there's really high revenues they're realizing in the, for example, Kaizen or ERCOT markets. But for some reason, a lot of people think that that's going to evaporate soon. Even though we're seeing increasing renewable penetration and kind of increasing volatility in market. And last but not the least, obviously, so developing and constructing your project is dependent really on an array of permits. So kind of conclusion highlights, quickly summarize it, but solar and storage is now the economic and reliable choice, outperforming fossil resources. We're seeing significant resources come onto the grid, tens of gigawatts across markets. Hybrid and co-located solar and storage resources have certain advantages. We'll likely see a continued growth, and again, we're seeing interest from customers in a range of products that really meet their clean energy needs. So with that, I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If not, let me know. My name is John Newman. I am on the market applications team at Fluence. And our team focuses on expanding the market for energy storage and helping to shape our products to meet the broad range of customer needs across different segments, applications, and regions. So one of those applications that I focus on is solar plus storage hybrids. So I titled my presentation, Putting the Storage in Solar plus Storage. So I'll be really focusing on the value case and value streams of storage and hybrids and co-located assets. So if you think back to Will's presentation, really thinking about that storage adder value that he was talking about. So I'll give a very brief introduction to Fluence for anyone who hasn't heard of us before to start, but then I'll spend the majority of my time talking about how we think about the value of storage and what that value can add to a solar asset, including a broad range of value streams that you can capture. I'll do a very quick trip around some markets around the world and how we're seeing solar plus storage outside of the US. And then lastly, touch on how we at Fluence think and talk about AC and DC coupled considerations. So to touch a little bit about Fluence, for those that aren't familiar with us, Fluence's mission is to transform the way we power our world. And obviously, we believe energy storage is the cornerstone of the energy transition in a zero carbon electric grid future. So to support that mission, we provide energy storage technology and services to a broad range of customers across the energy landscape. As a company and broader energy storage industry, we've come a long way since Fluence first commercialized the first grid-scale lithium-ion battery in 2008. And since then, as a company, we have deployed or contracted for 2.7 gigawatts of storage globally, and that is across over 150 projects in 29 different markets. So with more than 13 years of experience in energy storage, we are a trusted partner pairing our intimate market knowledge with cutting edge technology and operational services. So with that, I will get into here some more of the value that we believe storage can provide and add to solar. With any storage project or asset, one of the most important steps is to consider the wide array of value streams the asset can provide. Energy storage is one of the first truly digital assets on the grid, which gives it the capacity and capability to capture multiple revenue and value streams. Sometimes people may not be considering everything that the storage asset can do, or the market may struggle to actually value what it's capable of. But at the end of the day, ignoring any of these value streams leaves money on the table. And of course, this is no different for solar plus storage assets. So the way I typically think about the value streams or the rationale for adding storage to solar, again, focusing on the value and revenue side, not necessarily on the cost saving side, but it is across these 5 different buckets. Before I talk about them, I think it's important to recognize that some of these are direct revenue boosts to the solar asset, while others might be risk mitigation or risk mitigation value streams. Nonetheless, each provides unique value in its own right, and the 5 are often mixed and matched together in kind of the infamous value stacking. So moving through these, just to hit on each of them from left to right. The first is it's probably what the image of solar plus storage that likely enters everyone's mind when they think about co-located assets. That's time shifting. So taking solar energy and shifting it to higher demand periods, as we've seen with duck curves, it's often going to be in the afternoon or early evening. And this can include either curtailed solar or clipped solar energy. The next one here is the opportunity to reduce the need to procure energy on the wholesale market for, often you see this with a utility or an IPP, by leveraging the storage to provide firm power. So this is often driven by a requirement to serve load or meet PPA requirements. And so storage can help mitigate some of that risk and de-risk the overall combined asset and generation fleet for a load serving entity or an IPP. In the middle here is the ability to open new revenue streams in the wholesale market. So these are tasks that we often think of standalone storage as doing, but co-located and hybrid assets can absolutely do this as well. And so here you're leveraging the storage asset to enhance merchant trading, so energy arbitrage, along with providing ancillary services into the market. Fourth here is the ability of storage to support direct integration of renewable assets by smoothing that variable output throughout solar hours, supporting ramp rate control, limiting interconnection upgrade requirements, really anything that helps integrate that renewable or solar, in this case, asset onto the grid. And then finally, this has been touched on a couple times, but is the ability to capture additional incentives. The most obvious example being the ITC, which at the moment is only for co-located storage. Hopefully, I think a lot of people here would agree that that will change soon and it will be a standalone storage, but at the moment, you need to be co-located with the ITC. But there's also other state and local programs that incentivize solar plus storage. So across each of these, I want to highlight that individual projects can vary greatly across duration, sizes, configurations, but to touch on or hit some favorable or typical system designs, I've noted what we often think of as the default use case under ideal conditions, but again, each project is different and market rules and fundamentals are really going to impact this. But if you think about duration for these, the energy shifting, the risk mitigation, and the incentive capture, these are often going to be favoring longer duration assets, 4 to 6 hour or even 8 hour assets. The ITC maybe not so much on having a favorability on a duration, but some of the more local and state incentives certainly do on that category. Otherwise, the merchant trading and flexibility services, as we see with standalone storage, when you're trying to capture ancillary services, shorter duration is often what you see. So if that's your primary value case, even with hybrids, we typically still see shorter duration assets. Whereas integration of renewables, much broader, various durations that needs. In terms of AC versus DC coupling, again, these are under kind of ideal conditions. These impacted by many other things for individual products, but energy shifting and incentive capture often lead to DC coupled assets, while all of the others often are more favorable to AC coupled systems, particularly the merchant trading flexibility services value case in the middle here. So as I mentioned, solar plus storage is certainly not only a US phenomena, and Fluence as a global organization, we're seeing a lot of these solar plus storage use cases continue to merge on every continent. So just to take a quick trip around the world, starting here in the US, which I think people are most familiar with, we're seeing a significant volume of solar plus storage, as we saw in the other presentations in the West, particularly in California, to provide that energy shifting use case to help offset the duck curve and provide resource adequacy. Moving over into the Middle East, Israel has actually emerged as one of the largest solar plus storage markets, with major tenders already having occurred and many more expected to come in the future. And those tenders are requiring asset owners to add 4-hour storage to maximize the amount of solar energy delivered to the grid. So there, it's again, that's that energy shifting use case, but significant amount of DC coupled is expected in that. In India, renewables are expected to explode in the coming years, particularly solar energy. And given the relatively weak grid strength in much of the country, storage will be particularly valuable in integrating the solar into the system, providing smooth and reliable generation. So if you think of the fourth bucket on the previous slide, that's what we're seeing there. And then the last one I'll highlight is in Chile. We're seeing storage added to solar assets to mitigate risk across IPP's generation fleets. So just a smattering of various countries around the world. In dark blue, you see some additional growth markets for solar plus storage. But I expect in 6 months, this map will look completely different as more and more places start to pop up as viable business cases. The next thing I wanted to touch on, and I'll try to keep it short in the interest of time, is some key decisions or thoughts around solar plus storage between AC coupling and DC coupling. I won't get into any of the technical or operational design details of these two types of systems, but at a high level, right, AC coupled systems have independent inverters for the solar asset and storage asset, but are still co-located, often sharing some balance of plant equipment and a single point of interconnection. Whereas DC coupled systems, the solar and storage assets share a single inverter and are connected on the same DC bus, allowing the storage asset to be charged directly with solar generation. So just to highlight too, one question is often around scope and how these configurations are procured and the technology is delivered. So just to highlight that, what is typically Fluence's scope on these, on the AC coupled, we're providing sort of more or less what looks like a standalone storage asset. So we're providing the battery through the inverters, and someone else, the solar OEM or provider, is going to be providing the solar array and the solar inverter. On DC coupled, that gets flipped around a little bit, and so Fluence's scope will typically include the battery, the shared inverter, and then the DC-DC converters with a third party providing the solar equipment. So this creates a lot more points of interaction and interconnection between the solar and the battery assets for DC coupled, and so that can create additional challenges that it's important to have an experienced partner with on those. In terms of the value cases for AC and DC coupled, I won't touch again on the 5 buckets. I've mapped those out as we talked about them on the previous slide, but there are a few other constraints or complexities to think about when adding storage to solar assets. So the first is that there's often a tug of war between a constraint of land or a constraint of interconnection. And so when land is the limiting factor, often the solar cannot be oversized. And so there's a reduced amount of clipped energy. And also often that suggests that AC coupling may be a more beneficial structure. If it's the interconnection that's actually limiting and there's ample solar space, then DC coupling may favor DC coupling your system. Again, you can then oversize your solar to the interconnection or your inverter size. That'll create a significant amount of clipped energy, and so the DC coupled system's better positioned to capture that. On grid charging constraints, if it's a monodirectional asset that's not allowed to charge from the grid, that's going to really favor DC coupled, and that way you can capture that clipped energy. It's not going to be able to capture the merchant trading or ancillary service revenues significantly, and so that's going to really favor that DC coupled system, whereas bidirectional could favor either, but may open up more opportunities for AC coupled in particular. And then the last thing, 2 complexities, I'll call them, to highlight one for each AC and DC coupled, right? To truly capture the optimized value of an AC coupled system, you need advanced digital controls that can control the dual inverters together and ensure that you're truly integrating those solutions for maximum value. So when procuring those systems, it's important to make sure you're considering what your power plant controller looks like and that that's something that's experienced and tested in the field. And then on the DC coupled side, as I mentioned on the previous side, there's the contracting complexity, right? With overlapping and integrated scopes between the solar and storage providers, it really requires commercial and engineering experience and field knowledge of how to make sure that those 2 assets can operate smoothly together. So here, I'll go through this graphic very quickly, but the idea is just to highlight the value of DC coupling for energy shifting. So if you have kind of a standard solar 1.3 DC generation capacity to your inverter AC capacity. You're going to have a little bit of clipped energy. There's not a ton of value in that. It's fairly small. But if you start to actually far more oversize up to 1.8, even up to 2.5 ratio your solar capacity to inverter, you're going to get a significantly larger amount of clipped energy. And that's where storage on the DC coupled side can really provide a lot of value. So the vast majority of that clipped energy here goes straight into the battery, and that can then be time shifted to extend out the solar generation later into the evening during those peak periods. So with that, I'll wrap up. Hopefully we have time for a few questions, but I'll do just a quick self-promotion plug. A lot of this content's in our recent white paper on solar plus storage, so definitely check it out on fluenceenergy.com. And of course, here is my email. Feel free to send any questions or comments or thoughts my way. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, John, and all the presenters. We have some questions. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to get straight away at it and pick a few here. A question for, well, anybody, but I think probably Gigio or John. In a typical solar installation, what are the annual full charge discharge cycles, and how frequently do the batteries need to be replaced?
Yeah, I can start, and Gigio, feel free to jump in. So in terms of how often, I think the first part of that was how often the storage asset's actually going to be charged and discharged. That's really going to be, if you think about those 5 use cases that I was talking about, highly dependent on those. I think probably if you're thinking about energy shifting, it's most likely one cycle per day for the year, which is a pretty average amount. If you're talking more about merchant revenues and energy arbitrage and flexibility services, particularly in markets like ERCOT, you can start to see, maybe there's 2 or 3 cycles even, if you're really trying to run the system very quickly. So again, it very much depends on the use case. In terms of the degradation, that also depends on the amount of cycles and throughput of energy. We design the system so that they can be 15, 20-year assets, and that augmentation or battery replacement is built into the cost of the system as basically an O&M cost. And so we're augmenting and shifting around the batteries throughout the lifetime to maintain a specific rated capacity if that's required.
Okay, thanks. Next one is interesting. It's addressed to Gigio, but I think all of the presenters might have an opinion on this. Gigio, you listed cost savings benefits of hybrids. What about revenue benefits? Or, as Will indicated, are you settling for revenue penalties by co-locating solar and storage?
So I think Will's graphs were really informative. It really depends on the pieces, but if you're sharing the point of interconnection, there's definitely a penalty to that, because there are times that energy is valuable and solar is producing, and so it's limiting the amount of energy storage energy you can put on a system. So there's a kind of called the point of interconnection sharing penalty. And then also depending on these ITC grid charging rules. So if you're in order to capture the ITC, you're limiting grid charging, you're also potentially avoiding times that you could get paid to charge from the grid, but you can't or don't want to do it due to the ITC rules. So it's definitely a trade-off. Now, actually, one thing I want to add, there is also that benefit of capturing the clipped energy too, right? That otherwise would be lost. So
I know we're at time. The only thing I'd quickly add on my point, I didn't get to speak too much about the sensitivity, but one of my points is that there's volatility elsewhere in the market that might not be a solar or wind site. But what I didn't say is that, I have, as an analyst, obviously I have the benefit of perfect foresight of the past, and it's easy to identify those locations. Predicting what those will be in the future is hard. And so, yes, I did say there's a penalty, but identifying high volatility sites is no easy task.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm afraid we've arrived at the end of the hour, and I'd like to thank the presenters for a very informative session. If you'd like to continue this discussion, please join us on the Zoom platform with your invitations for a half an hour with Neil Bradshaw of SunGrow. So please stay safe and healthy and have a great rest of the day. And I'll see some of you over on the Zoom platform. Take care.